Good afternoon to everyone. My name's Dr. Andy Kirkland and I'm a lecturer in sport coaching at the University of Stirling. Now, I'm doing this video for a new module I'm writing on our MSc programme in performance sport coaching. And the module is called Identifying and Solving Problems. I thought maybe I'll put this presentation out on YouTube and post it on social media too, because I think it may actually be of interest to a wider audience. Now, the module Identifying and Solving Problems is a bit like a research methods module, but hopefully not quite as boring. The outcomes aren't focused on delivering great research or research projects as much as the main purpose, which is to support coaches to become better problem solvers and decision makers through rigorous practice. In this video, I'm going to present a case of why I believe philosophy is so important, and in fact so important to you, and a bit about why, or a bit on my philosophical outlook to coaching and research. Now, if we go back, let me see, 15 odd years when I was conducting sport science research. So I was looking at pacing strategy in cycle time trials using physiology approaches to do so. I barely had a clue that I had a philosophy or a philosophy of knowledge. So how did I create my knowledge? What methods did I use? I simply assimilated with the methods that were provided to me through disciplinary norms. These fundamentally influenced how I solved problems. It presented challenges to the way I think as well, and sometimes I'm thinking when I was looking at fatigue, how do psychological aspects of performance impact on that fatiguing process? But that was out my lane, and it wasn't something that I was meant to solve problems on, so I was encouraged to stay away. So I suppose I was a bit of a logical positivist. It's up to you if you want to Google what a logical positivist is, but I'll cover some principles surrounding these names later on. Now, if we consider that our knowledge is forever developing and that our beliefs and values change, then being able to articulate a philosophy of anything is like taking a snapshot photograph and suggesting it captures everything about us. A photograph is just one moment in time, probably anything from a 5,000th of a second on my Nikon down to a slow exposure of about 10 seconds. So it's just a snapshot in that moment. I'm a hats wearing man, and I wear different hats depending on what mood I'm in, what image I want to portray to the world, and who my audience is. So I've got a lovely Homburg hat, a bit like Winston Churchill had, as well as baseball caps, a few trilbies, some beanies, and the hat I wear depends on what mood I'm in and what image I want to portray. And that's a bit like philosophy as well. It changes over time. It changes on who we're working with. It changes with the social dynamic. So it's really difficult to articulate what philosophy is. I really like Julian North's ERE model, though, in which Julian suggests that the nature of reality is relational and has emergent properties. It's ever changing. Thus, my research philosophy is in a continual dynamic state of internal equilibrium. It's constantly adapting and evolving in relation to environmental constraints. So expecting someone to write down a 200-word philosophy or whatever, I believe is slightly unrealistic. We need to dig deeper into knowledge and knowledge creation, values and beliefs. It's quite a deep subject. Now, I wrote a paper with my buddy and colleague Joe Cowley, in which we said that research should be sensitive to context, and the often theoretical nature of coaching, or a theoretical nature of coaching in fact, in which coaching behaviours are in part enunciations of social structures in which they emerge. So we must be sensitive to the realities of the world and how things change. Therefore, I believe the answer to most research questions, and in fact most problems, is it depends. And that we should focus on what it depends on in certain contexts. So there's rarely magic bullets, there's rarely simple answers, specifically with complex problems. What we want to know is what it depends upon. As someone schooled in positivism, I see a place for hypothesis testing, and that the truth of the matter may become clearer with the use of statistical tests too. But I also believe that such methods can be self-serving because they usually answer questions with the answer that more research is needed, rather than offering practical and implementable recommendations that work in context. I also get muddled with philosophies of knowledge construction, so epistemology and ontology in fact, that are got names such as constructivism, interpretism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and a multitude of other isms. And I get muddled believing that they don't necessarily help us get closer to the truth of the matter or help us better understand the world we live in. Sometimes they can reveal additional layers of existence. They can encourage us to think in different ways, which adds to our knowledge, but do they have practical effect other than encouraging us to think in ever increasing levels of abstraction? I know a colleague who was asked to do major revisions in their PhD because the examiners did not believe that their methods reflected a constructivist approach. The examiners thought it was something else. However, the reality is that many philosophies of knowledge have substantial overlap, with differences being academic, sometimes inconsequential, rather than being practically important. But philosophy of knowledge, having an appreciation of it and why it is important, is fundamental to how I appraise evidence, how I see the world, and how I solve questions. It's one of the most important, if not the most important things that I've learnt about in my 25-year career working in sport. Philosophy and the philosophy of knowledge is the most decisive thing that I've learnt about. It's helped me understand the world far more. As an example, I think the paper from Owen 2023 is a case in point to highlight the importance of philosophy. Now, Owen explores the question, what is formulation in psychiatry? Now, I've got an interest in psychiatry because my research is concerned with developing healthy environments and thus mental health too. And much of the language we use in mental health comes from psychiatry. So DSM-5 and the nosology and diagnostic processes in DSM-5. So that's why I ended up reading OWN 23 or 2023, and I was introduced to it by a psychiatrist who uses formulation in their practice too, and it's really fascinating. It's a great way, or it's a great method that can be used and applied in coaching too if you understand it. But that's not what I'm talking about here. In the paper, Owen states that most patients want their experiences to be understood by the clinician, whilst also being offered interventions that make a difference to their mental health and well-being. That's the purpose of the job of a psychiatrist, is to make a positive difference to the mental health of the patient. Current practice surrounding mental health is tacitly conducted through a biomedical positivistic lens, though, in which the signs and symptoms usually result in a diagnosis using a diagnostic hierarchy typically contained within DSM-5. However, I don't believe it's true, I argue that mental health is complex, and the cause of poor mental health is usually the consequence of a convergence of multiple biological, psychological and social factors which are unique to the individual patient. I call myself a biopsycho sociologist as well, because that's reflective of how I solve problems in the coaching world, through multiple different lenses and considering how these lenses, the light that comes through them, converges into one point. So that's a biopsychosocial perspective. So these factors are unique to the patient. Therefore, formulation is an analytical and evaluative process in which it explores an individual's case on what cause depends upon, so what's causing the poor health. And we know that that's typically a convergence of multiple different factors. This means the causality, or let's start again. The meaning of causality is philosophically contested, and a debate that's covered in a really excellent paper by Groff 2017, which is called Causal Mechanisms and the Philosophy of Causation. I call myself a critical realist, and more of what critical realism is in a minute. But I'd argue that case formulation is consistent with a critical realist perspective, insofar as in an open ecological system, causation is complex, hard to define, and emerges through the symbiotic relationship between social reality and human agency, basically what we've got the time and power to do. Of course, there are biological and psychological factors that can be better understood through a positivistic lens. So types of experimentation, types of clinical trials and so on. Positivistic lenses for doing these types of trials is often the most appropriate thing to do. But social factors, more often than not, cause the signs and symptoms of a particular illness. But medical education and thus practice is typically based on too narrow a philosophical lens, and causes of many illnesses go unaddressed and or treatment is ineffective as a result. And I would argue that that's because social factors tend to be swept under the carpet in diagnostic processes, perhaps due to the agency of GPs and such as well. I've not got enough time to examine the whole life course of a patient who's presented to them. But ultimately, philosophy is about understanding the physical and metaphysical world we exist and socially interact within. Now, whether our philosophy is tacit or not, what we know, believe and value have a profound effect on how we see the world and how we act within it. For example, in the West, philosophically we're more focused on the individual rather than on community and the common good. Medicine in the West is more focused on the signs and symptoms and treatment of illness rather than good health and identifying the causes of good health. And treatment tends to avoid the social causes. That's philosophical. Coaching as a discipline is more of a smorgasbord of theoretical and theoretical stuff, with philosophical approaches most dependent on what camp you sit in, what tribe you're in. I sit in the it depends tribe. The atheoretical generally applies to systems of coach education too, so how things work in practice. It tends to be atheoretical, although some within the system are starting to advocate approaches like ecological dynamics too. Now, the key to any belief system or method of knowing is that they're used to empower rather than constrain. We want to get closer to the truth of the matter rather than using set rules which may constrain us and prevent us from getting closer to the truth. We need to be open to recognizing assumptions that are inherently flawed and often mean that recommendations emanating from theory don't work in practice. Periodization is a case in point, so how we organize training in sport. It may work in a limited number of cases, perhaps Olympic weightlifting, or it can be used as a good management structure, but it's not a very good performance optimization tool because of its flawed assumptions. Again, that's deeply philosophical. Okay, it's time for me to start to wrap up and pin my colours to the mast more though. Tom Fryer from the University of Manchester wrote an excellent wee handbook titled Why Everyone Should Be a Critical Realist. Simply, critical realism is a philosophy that posits and recognises the subjective and non-material nature of human existence is very real. So the subjective, our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions that are hard to quantify, things like affect theory and stuff that are hard to measure, reflect human existence and are important. However, the position does not completely reject a positivist approach on focusing on objective reality. So it's like a mixed model that allows us to explore the material and the non-material relating to existence, human adaptation, and so on. As an example, one of the best books I've read is one by Louis Vicomte, and he's a social anthropologist. And Vicomte's book was called Body and Soul, and that's a sociological account surrounding boxing in Chicago's West Side. Vicomte's account is rich in subjection, perception, but also analytical rigor and reflexivity. So there's clear process and rigor behind his thinking of describing and exploring this very complex environment in a really rich way. At the end of the book, the reader will have gained a deep appreciation of the social importance of boxing in a particular community in Chicago, and the related consequences of social deprivation in the area, and also a deeper appreciation of who the champion boxers were and who the journeymen were too, and what their experiences of existence were. And it gives us a really rich understanding of boxing culture. As a critical realist, I believe that a more conventional and positivistic approach could add additional layers to Vicomte's story. However, it's the social conditions that drive most of the boxers' behaviours, and these are key to understanding. The trainers come coaches in that environment are very, very similar to Mickey Goldmill. If you remember Mickey, the trainer in Rocky 1. And this is the reality of that world, that the trainers are like Mickey, not necessarily highly educated. They've orientated towards a coaching come training role through soaking up the environment like a sponge and trying to help others. I doubt whether Mickey would have been open to learning about ecological dynamics, though. That's not to say that Mickey didn't use some of those approaches when he was coaching Rocky, and that these approaches were not analogous to Eco-D approaches. It's just that that particular theoretical lens wouldn't tell the whole story. It doesn't take into account important factors. And I think that's why critical realism is really important. It allows us to paint a bigger picture that considers the biological, the psychological, the social in a convergent way, and realizing that cause is emergent from relationships and is relational and emerges from the environment in which we're in. An important aspect of my own belief system, and thus my philosophy, is to avoid dualism. In other words, I want to avoid two conflicting positions, recognizing that both can be true. For example, the same human being can be both very selfish and benevolent, in which behaviours may be driven by self-interest or for the benefit of others, all at the same time. Such philosophical questions were explored by my fellow Edinburgher philosopher David Hume back in the 18th century. And Edinburgh was a hotbed of innovation in philosophy and medicine and understanding the natural world at the time. And that was the period of the Enlightenment. So it doesn't take much of a stretch of one's imagination to think that David Hume probably frequented the same clubs as innovators in medicine too. So that my guess is that his musings and cause influenced the development of biomedical approaches in medicine. All right, so yeah, I'm about to wrap up. So I believe that as coaches, talking about so as coaches we should be benevolent and act in the interest of others. That's what I do. I want to share my energy in a particular way that's in the best interest of others. I'm actually pretty rubbish at acting in self-interest. Things like career progression and earning lots of money and such don't necessarily mean a lot to me. Being this way isn't always helpful to my own existence though, so following that particular approach to life means is it likely that I'll become a key decision maker that I think I'm really capable of doing well at? Probably not. So again, there's conflicting things in my philosophy there. But I have also acted in self-interest when my ability to keep the roof over my head has been threatened. In situations where I'm passionate about wanting change and thinking my approach is perhaps better than the status quo, my behaviours to some who hold more power than me but want to maintain that status quo, well, my behaviours to these individuals may be more underhand and less benevolent. In other words, I play the game when I need to, recognising that not all humans are benevolent and many act in their own best interests. But many of the worst things done by humans in history have been justified by my argument here, that I'm acting for the common good. We're all fallible and susceptible to bias, but having a deeper understanding of our philosophy of knowledge and our philosophy of thinking and solving problems can help us be less susceptible to these biases. I also recognise that there would be undesirable consequences if everyone thought like me. If we were all great at identifying and solving problems, firstly, I wouldn't be in a job because I wouldn't have to teach anyone to be better at these things. There would be less need for so many people to work in sport or indeed universities if everyone was good at what they did. We would have fewer disciplines and sub-disciplines in higher education, and reaching consensus would take one meeting and not 20. What are the consequences for being employed if everything worked perfectly? It's probably not ideal. Unlike when I started studying sports science though, I now believe that learning the basics of philosophical reasoning is the best thing we can do to become better coaches, to become better decision makers and problem solvers. To end, it's another thing convincing the world that this should be the case though. All that I encourage you to do is to explore what philosophy means to you and how you would articulate your philosophy of problem solving and perhaps your coaching philosophy. Thanks so much for listening, and that's all for now.